The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show with me, Charles Christian. Thank you so much for tuning in again. Well, after the enthusiasm for the interview with Doctor Who scriptwriter and Rivers of London author Ben Aronovich, which we dug out of the archives and put on a show a couple of weeks back, we thought we'd keep up with the urban fantasy fiction theme and dust off our interview from last year with G.S. Denning, the author of the Warlock Homes novels. And no, we haven't forgotten about the Dresden Chronicles, and in fact are at this very moment trying to hunt down Jim Butcher for an interview. More about that later. But first, before we go any further, here's Janie. And as promised, here's Janie, and Janie's going to be talking about an obscure area of folklore, the fabled Vegetable Lamb of Tartary.
Hello. Yes, and you did hear that right. I am talking indeed about a vegetable lamb of Tartary, which obviously is somewhere in Central Asia, I believe. Not that good with geography, but anyway, what seems to have happened is, some time in the Middle Ages, somebody was wandering along and saw something rather strange. Very strange and eye-catching, actually. It was a plant with stalks coming out the ground, but here was the rather strange bit. It was bearing a life-sized lamb hovering a few feet off the ground, which was also bleating, just for added effect. And yeah, it's ancient folklore. And if you saw one of these, you would be looking at what was called the Vegetable Lamb of Tartary. I'm just thinking lamb tart. Anyway, no, I'm going off on one there. Anyway, so, but, you needn't be bothered because it was a plant properly stuck in the ground. Clearly a plant, but it was thought to be some sort of animal-plant hybrid. And there's lots of legend around it. It's possibly completely imaginary, but there's so much folklore around it and text that you do wonder quite if there was some root, excuse the pun, of truth there. So, yes, it starts popping up in ancient Hebrew text and medieval literature, even philosophy, poetry, and even sort of they started to try and delve into the science of it, which, of course, as will become clear, that was entirely possible. But so it had many names, one of them being called the lamb tree, okay? The Tartarian lamb. And yes, it was kind of mythical, but it did inspire a lot of people to wax lyrical about it and to try to describe it and to work out what it was for centuries, actually. Yeah. So there was a 19th century naturalist called Henry Lee, apparently, and he rather, got his arms around this to work out what was going on about it and wrote extensively about it. A woolly plant, the lamb tree. And that popped up actually even much earlier, but he was the one that, the name of the lamb tree, but he really did look into it and describe it and try to work out what it was like. And his description was attributed actually to Rabbi Johanan, that it was, just to give you a picture, a plant animal that is in the form of a lamb, and from its navel grew a stem or root by which this zoophyte, which is obviously sort of animal type, scientific word, was fixed like a gourd to the soil below the surface. So you've got a picture there. Anyway, so even got described as lambs born from a gourd-like fruit as little beasts. So they really thought that they were actually little animals. It was taken quite seriously in medieval England that there was such a thing as a lamb tree. And the way it worked was that there was a plant, it branched out into several seed pods from which newborn lambs would spring forth. In another version, apparently, each plant bore a single fully grown lamb with a thick coat of wool as white as snow. Because, obviously, at this point, everybody had wool outfits on. Wool cloaks, wool trousers, wool knickers, wool pants. Ooh, scratchy.
Yes.
No wonder they're so cross all the time, always having punch-ups. Scratchy knickers on. And anyway, yes, it got strange features, like it was thought that it sort of hovered off the ground on this stalk, but the stalk allowed it to bend deeply enough to eat the grass below. So they thought it through that, it must, if it's a lamb, it's got to eat grass, hasn't it? The only trouble, obviously, to that was that the grass would eventually run out. And then, once it had eaten all the grass around it, it would die.
Yes.
Which, of course, it would do anyway, if it was a plant. It was thought to be a bit of a delicacy if you could find a live vegetable lamb. Although I can't imagine it was that great to eat. You'd have thought that one would have died out a bit early as they went, yeah. But it got a bit of traction with an ancient writer saying it tastes like the flesh of a fish, and that the lamb vegetable that tasted like fish wasn't peculiar enough. It also contained blood as sweet as honey. I'm just thinking here, are we looking at early corn, do you think? They're onto it quite early. But, yeah, pretty soon naturalists did begin to make the point that maybe, just maybe, the plants simply looked like lambs. Don't know how long that took. Several centuries.
Several
centuries, yes. But then again, we look at our COVID record at the moment. It seems to be taking us several centuries to work out a few fairly basic facts about it.
Yeah. Quite well made.
Yeah. So as everybody's obviously now started to twig, we are, of course, talking probably about cotton plants. And they think cotton was brought to Western Asia, Eastern Europe from India. But the Greeks didn't really know that much about the cotton plant. And they talked a lot about it, but again, they hadn't quite got the idea of it. Greek historian Herodotus' writings refer to a cotton padding of corselet sent from Egypt, fleeces from the trees. And Alexander the Great's admiral would later write that there were in India trees bearing flocks of bunches of wool. Even our friend Pliny the Elder got in on it and went further, saying that these trees bear gourds which burst when ripe. Yeah, so he was quite on it really there. Yeah, so there was a little bit more confusion as to the kind of lamb things, so maybe they weren't quite as fanciful as it would seem, because there's a confusing fact that the Greek word for melon can be translated into fruit, apple, or sheep. See? So the whole thing might be, it's just possible that throughout the various translations of early texts describing the cotton plant, among other trees, the actual, if you like, fruits was sort of mistranslated to spring apples, but could have been maybe interpreted as spring lambs. Yeah. And though the vegetable lamb wasn't real, it just shows you how science and mythology and poetic license, fact and fiction. Oh, how similar this all seems. Just they haven't mentioned political in here. Often, all those things can be kind of melded and mixed and seem similar to people. Yeah, so obviously the vegetable lamb has gone from our minds. Now
it's just cotton.
It was just cotton, yeah. But yeah, it was a sort of strange thing that was myth, and it was scientific, and they tried their best, and obviously. One is wondering whether some of them might have been just a little bit on the vegetarian, vegan side of things, rather hoping they could stop roasting baby sheep and have something. It was a bit like tofu mixed with corn, mixed with cotton wool, really, I suppose, which is why it didn't take off that well. And so they thought, I know what we do. We make a pair of nice, smooth, comfy underpants out of it. And that was your wife fronts.
Yeah.
Just done, That's how that came out.
That's how it came out. They could have made candy floss or cotton candy out of it, couldn't they?
Well, they could, but then, it goes a bit sticky, to be fair.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
Anyway, that's
we say goodbye to the Vegetable Lamb of Tartary, not appearing on a menu anywhere near you anytime.
No. And I'll go too.
Thank you very much. And now we're talking to Las Vegas-based author G.S. Denning about the adventures of his fictional dark comedy fantasy character, Warlock Holmes. And we also hear about Cthulhu, yay, H.P. Lovecraft, The King in Yellow, as well as bottomless French fries and the beneficial effects of toast. Yes, burnt bread toast. Right, and it's my great pleasure to be speaking to the author G.S. Denning. Do I call you G.S. or Gabe for the purpose of this?
Call me Gabe. G.S. is a dirty, dirty lie that I just I put on books for a couple of reasons. One is because Gabe is awful, and two is because no one can tell my gender. And it's snoopier that way.
Yeah, that's interesting, that one. Yes, there's a few authors who go that route. Okay, so about the monsters. I mean, obviously, we've discussed some of this by email beforehand, and a lot of hype about the latest Godzilla movie.
Well, there's always hype about Godzilla movies. Half the time that's most of what they wind up being. This big, grand thing that gets turned into, sort of a cobbled together story. I want to love Godzilla much more than I do.
Yeah, he was far more lovable back in the days when it was quite clearly a Japanese guy in a rubber suit.
Right, I sort of agree. And you had a famous American detective buried in rubble on some Hollywood set trying to explain what the heck had happened in that movie.
Yes. But I say, you mentioned that Godzilla's not particularly something you're that keen on. But, what is our fascination with monsters? And I mean, it goes all the way back to Sumerian times and demons, and they had a fairly bizarre panoply of demonic creatures to haunt them, some good, some bad. We've obviously got this deep down fascination for them. What do you think the issue is here, or where do you think it stems from?
Well, I think there's two funny tie-ins that immediately strike me. One is that, of course, Britain and Japan are both island nations. There's water out. You want to get anywhere else, you got to deal with, scary water, deep, cold, can't drink it. It just dies if you go into it. It's a massive force of nature that sets you apart sort of from the rest of humanity in a sense. And it's this gigantic, powerful force that, especially, in the earlier your level of technological sophistication, the more of a barrier it is. And then, when you start talking about a super arid area like the Middle East and, Sumerian times, water, of course, is of paramount importance because, I mean, you need it to survive on a daily level. You need it to make crops. It's scarce. There are, you've got your Tigris and your Euphrates areas that are, and the flooding Nile, Delta, where water makes civilization, water makes life. It's so important for these early human societies, but at the same time, its scarcity is so terrifying. And you have the threats of drowning, the idea that though it is like fire, it's needed, but it's also in a sense dangerous. You can die in there.
Yeah.
And so it's, when humans start making their folklore, they start making their gods, they start making their monsters, I think it's very natural for them to talk about the things that are very important to them. That in the case of an arid area like Sumeria, Babylon, they have such an immediate survival need associated with. And in areas like Japan or like Britain, where so much of their identity is determined by that water barrier between them and the other civilizations they know.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Of course, the other big ancient civilization that depended on water was China, and they similarly have monsters, in their case dragons, featuring very heavily in their mythology and culture.
I was like my daughter right now. My oldest daughter really loves the idea of Chinese dragons. She's got stuffed dragons. She loves the idea that these dragons can be friendly and helpful and needed, benevolent. I like that too. It's fine. Looking at the Transylvanian and Wallachian dragons. They have this very early appearance where a dragon is an earthquake. Mm-hmm. And it's not that the dragon caused an earthquake or a big monster stomped. It comes across the dragon is the earthquake. So on the one hand, you in Europe you have this idea of a dragon as a devastating natural event, and then in China you have this great idea of the dragons as bringers of benevolent and needed natural events.
Yeah.
The celestial court of dragons is going to give you rain if you deserve it or if you ask nicely.
Yeah. The tie-in with dragons and the landscape and the like is certainly over in here in the UK. There's several geographic rock formations that are supposedly the fossilized bones of dead dragons, where there's a rocky outcrop and in the middle of a field, if you like. And what is that? Where did that come from? Well, it's dragon bones.
I love that idea, giants and dragons in the landscape. It's funny. So in America, we have, of course, a much younger tradition of our own national narratives. And I think that's why we borrow so many of yours, to be honest. It's, I love that really old sort of, stretching back to medieval times. Well, even farther, really. But,
yeah.
Especially becoming prevalent in medieval times that giants and monsters and dragons and just, it's so cool. Thanks for letting us steal it.
We discussed in your emails H.P. Lovecraft. I mean, his whole ancient gods are just the most spectacular monsters. How do you see that fitting in? Let's have a bit of Cthulhu.
Right. A bit of Cthulhu. Well, that's a really good place to start because I think in many ways in Cthulhu he really lays out his ars poetica in a way. His reason for writing. When he talks, I believe it's in the beginning paragraph of that one. He talks about how, mankind's knowledge hasn't hurt it much yet. Mm-hmm. But that if we ever understand the totality of existence, the tiny little corner that we inhabit in it, our own lack of importance, and how we're destined to be crushed by these great and terrible forces, we could never be happy again. We could never be centered and at peace. And the only thing that could save us from the terror of that knowledge is a complete collapse of mankind's society and a return to another comforting dark age.
Mm.
I think that's really where he placed himself as far as folklore and stories about monsters and demons and dragons and things go, terrible gods. He came later. He was writing just after World War I really, really changed the world.
Yeah.
And he's not writing in an era where if you want to go and explore an unknown land, you can. Most everything is really known by that point.
Yeah.
Another thing that World War I did is really globalize the world. Right?
Yeah.
And he's not writing in a time when, you can be a conqueror. He just saw that try to happen in a sense, and how huge and intractable nation states and their sociological structures have become, how much more powerful than the individual's, ability to change them.
Mm-hmm.
And his mythos really kind of reflect that. They've got this sense of hopelessness, this sense of very large, very powerful structures that aren't going to be bested by the protagonists or anyone in that story. It's got to be discovered and dealt with, and you are so small and so helpless compared to them.
Yeah.
And along with that, there's not this bright, shiny sense of a protagonist going out and, beating a monster, and there's no Jabberwocky. You're not going to cut off any heads and return home triumphant, and everyone's telling you how awesome you were while you're telling them how awesome a monster was. They definitely have this sense of modernism to them that if they derive from folklore, they are certainly a modern folklore that is very directly based on huge changes to the world as we understood it. World War I starts with literal princes and shining breastplates on white horses charging into battle. And by the time it's over, the Age of Kings is over. The age of, especially Europe as it felt itself to be, its social structures that had existed for more than a millennia are just in ruins. And the power of industrialization and globalization and communication and all these things is becoming evident, and the world finds itself a little lost and awash. And I think that uncertainty is really reflected in his writings.
Mm-hmm. Where do you think he got his inspiration for his monsters from? Because Cthulhu is a unique creature, there's a touch of some of the Indian elephant-headed gods lurking in there, but so much else as well.
Yeah, huge and weird. And by the way, I stole one of my very favorite things from Cthulhu and put it in Warlock Holmes in book 1, and that is the idea that these giant creatures don't even inhabit the same number of spatial dimensions as humans do. And that you can only see them by the area where your perception fails and things don't make sense. The very second Warlock Holmes story, I lifted that idea whole cloth. Thank you, Lovecraft. As far as where he got his inspiration, here's the fight I'm going to pick. You ready?
Yeah.
He got it from Robert W. Chambers.
Right.
Who wrote, he wrote The King in Yellow.
Yeah.
In many ways, one of the best Lovecraftian writers, but also one who wrote before Lovecraft. In the 1890s, he wrote The King in Yellow.
Yeah.
And it is, get ready for angry letters. It's just better. I really think he is, he wrote a more literary book than Lovecraft ever did. The very first tale, I think it's called The Restorer of Reputations. He does a wonderful untrustworthy protagonist where, you're a narrator. You're listening to this guy describe the world and you're getting the idea of all these monsters and the suicide booths on the corner and, the evil. And then you just partway through, you realize, oh, no, I think this is just New York or maybe London. And that's a telephone booth. Yeah. And he's crazy. He's going to hurt the nice old man who drives a bus who comes by to make sure he's okay, So right there, he's using literary devices that Lovecraft sort of never equals or touches. And he also really defines that sense. Lovecraft, with few exceptions, doesn't tell you very clearly what his monsters look like. their usual lurking threats. Rats in the walls, they stay in the walls. Shadow over Innsmouth is one of the rare cases where he perfectly describes what these fish people look like in their different stages. But usually they're just these sort of faceless threats, and the protagonist gets close to seeing the horror, but if he'd seen it, he'd be crazy or he'd be dead, and he'd never be able to recount this story. And that definitely comes from Chambers. He doesn't always complete his narratives. He has this sort of thing where he implies the end, like the one where the lady's turned to stone, and we're pretty sure she turns back. And and a lot of that sort of Lovecraftian mystery mythos, I think, really gets laid down by Chambers almost 20 years before Lovecraft really gets into it. So I do think a big part of his inspiration is there. And you're talking about the Indian gods. The irony of that is that one of the things people really talk about when they talk about Lovecraft is his xenophobia. Mm-hmm. His works, in a sense, haven't aged well because of their racism, sexism, and xenophobia. So to the point where, like, if you want to bring any of his stuff to the screen now or to books, you've got to change it. You've got to adapt it because it's just not acceptable anymore. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I almost think that fed it, that fed his creativity. Because I mean, imagine him looking at a picture of Ganesh, and it is a few things to him. It's large and it's animalistic, but it's also alien and therefore scary. It's this reflection of a time and a culture and a system of belief, of understanding the world that he doesn't understand, which probably comes out of left field from him. And if you approach it that way, like if you can imagine you never had contact with it and you were seeing it from the first time, and, you had your own comfortable belief system and comfortable world, you can almost see Ganesh as Cthulhu, like this large, terrifying, mysterious thing emerging from the depths of ignorance, and a horrible new truth to deal with. So I like that angle of looking at Lovecraft's love of his own civilization being almost the basis for his fear of these monstrous outsiders, which, by the way, I also feel from my series.
And talking of your series, let's get round to that one. They're called Warlock Homes, and a clear reference to Sherlock, but in the blurb I've got here, it's described as a darkly comical retelling of the original Sherlock stories in the style of Douglas Adams and H.P. Lovecraft, which I think is wonderful because the language of Douglas Adams is entirely a million miles away from H.P. Lovecraft.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I mean, he actually does, Adams does get into some almost Lovecraftian ideals, the total perspective vortex, the big punishment in his books is that they're going to ruin your mind by showing you the entire universe and your tiny insignificant spot in it, which, by the way, is just the same as that first paragraph from Call of Cthulhu. So, for all his humor, I do think that Adams and Pratchett both dealt with some fairly dark elements. The feeling of how little we know and how much horror and lack of purpose and, how many damaging things to the human psyche could lurk in that unknown. I certainly...
Well, I mean... Just sort of jumping in there, the Hitchhiker's Guide starts off with that very thing, that Earth's going to be demolished at short notice because there's a intergalactic superhighway going through, and we haven't discovered space travel and haven't seen the demolition notices, which are
we didn't get around
several thousand light years away.
Yeah, right. So there is definitely that element of incredibly dark humor and dark sci-fi in that book. And I think, when people say Lovecraftian, it is seeping out. It is getting into most of our sci-fi and fantasy. We don't like, happy little stories about, princesses and princesses falling in love and living happily ever after anymore. To an extent, that's an endangered beast. Many of our stories do have a more grown-up, more, a grim outlook. And Lovecraft, I think, came around at the right time to be seen as just the poster child for that. It's funny, in my books, I use that a great deal, but my protagonist, Watson is in many ways the protagonist. He's the main character. He's the one who's smart enough to actually solve the mysteries. Holmes is this unstoppable cosmic force. I mean, he's God-killingly powerful, but he's also a bit of an idiot, and he's an optimist. He's this smiling, childish sort of man. And so even though our world is surrounded by these terrible outsiders and demons that want to come in and devour everyone, Holmes is two things in my books. He is, one, he's our best defense against it. He's both the only person who could stand up to them, but he's also the person who's most likely to mess up and let them in.
Yeah.
And he's also this voice of sort of cheery optimism that, as long as you're in London with a good jolly cup of, soup and some toast, everything's fine. It's happy. Enjoy where you are. And part of that comes from the fact that he knows of the horrors that lurk outside and how much better it is, in here than out there.
Yes. Mm. Yes. Well, I must admit, I'm a firm believer that toast answers most things.
yeah. And I'll spoil part of my own book in the second book, Hellhound of the Baskervilles. At the end, you get to see in many ways the day that Holmes met so many of the demons and gods that sort of serve him, and they're all promising him gifts. And one that I named after the Greek goddess of the hearth, Hestia, she promises him comfort. She says, look, you're going to live hundreds of years and everything that you know and love is going to be lost, to you in the tide of time. And when you feel that loss, have some toast, have some soup, you'll feel better. And that's sort of her gift to him to ingratiate himself. And as soon as he's done telling Watson the story, he says, I think she tricked me. I think toast and soup makes everyone feel that way.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
So give us a quick rundown on where you are with the series as of now, and without giving away any spoilers, what's coming up next.
Right. Okay. So I guess the best answer to that is I'm in the dark middle chapter. I stole Joss Whedon's structure, his television structure from Buffy, which is where there's a overall structure to the whole story. There's a structure to each of the seasons, or in my case, each of the books, because my books will contain they're direct parodies of Arthur Conan Doyle's 60 original stories, 56 of which were short stories and only 4 of which were novels. So most of my stories are fairly short. But each story has its own little arc. Each mystery stands on its own. Then each book goes together into an arc. Book 1 being sort of the introduction. Book 2 is Watson coming into his own as an adventurer and the origin for Holmes. Book 3 is the villains really showing their faces, Adler and Moriarty, and starting to mess up the boys' lives. Book 4, which just came out as we record this less than 3 weeks ago. Book 4 begins the real descent into darkness. I gave Watson Holmes's drug problem. In my version, it's not simply drugs. It's the old Persian flipper that Holmes has his tobacco in. That's not tobacco. That's an old Persian. That's a mummy of a sorcerer who got shredded up so he wouldn't come back to life and spread out all over the Persian kingdom, wrapped in his old clothes. Watson mistakes some of it for tobacco, smokes it, and has a mystic vision in book 3. In book 4, he's purposely liquidizing this with an alchemical kit and injecting it into himself so he can understand the magical world that Holmes lives in, so that he can get insights into the lives and the machinations of Adler and Moriarty so he can counter them. And it's killing him. It's destroying his body, but it is building his knowledge. of these things. So in book 4, Watson's on this downward slide where he's learning so much, he's becoming so much a part of that world, but he's just, he's wrecking himself. And oh boy, without spoiling too much, book 5 takes place in a time in the original Holmesian canon. It originally came much earlier, where Holmes and Watson aren't living together anymore. In my opinion, Holmes has basically banished Watson because he says, like, look, I figured this out. You're killing yourself. You can't do it. I'm building my life without you. Get out. So the book that I'm writing right now, book 5, which isn't out, so I'll try to make this chummy without putting in any direct spoilers. It's very much Watson trying to re-insinuate himself into that world of magic and mystery and adventure, having been very purposely shut out of it by Holmes. And he's got this frustration because now he understands it better. And he also knows he's much, much smarter than Holmes. And he thinks, he ought to be able to, to force himself back into the life that he wants. But Holmes has built a whole new life for him with Mary Morstan. And Holmes is so grotesquely powerful that Watson can't even see 221B. Baker Street has this sort of void of perception right in the middle of it. That Holmes can occasionally shout out of to tell him to go away. Yeah. So that's sort of where the books are right now.
Yeah. What's the time period it's set in? I mean, obviously Holmes is the late Victorian, Edwardian, through to First World War.
Right. I compressed it a little bit. I started right after the Battle of Maiwand. That is where my Watson gets wounded. And in my version, he's just ruined. I mean, he describes himself as a soldier who got shot and it's taking him 2 years to die. He says, the better ones had the wit to be unconscious before they hit the ground and dead 2 minutes later, and he just hadn't figured it out. He comes back to London completely lost and adrift and not taking care of himself. And just like in the originals, along comes an old friend, Stanford, and says, well, I know this guy you could live with really cheap. In my version, it's because no one wants to live with Holmes. He's clearly just haunted, messed up warlock. And it's out of sheer desperation that Watson starts to lodge with him. And that's where, but Watson, of course, also quickly begins, like everyone else does, to realize something's deeply wrong with him. But he also realizes that Holmes can't take care of himself. And so in a way, the Watson's return to normalcy is that not the pressure that he needs to take care of himself, but the pressure that he needs to take care of Holmes. And as he meets, Grogson and Lestrade, who in my version, it's Gregson from the original and Lestrade. In my version, Grogson is a big ogre who's constantly shaving himself to try and appear human. And Lestrade's just clearly a vampire. And they're all trying to get along, and they're solving all these supernatural crimes with Warlock because they know if they don't solve them, they'll be blamed with them. And Watson, he should have been a doctor. He should have been high placed in society, but the society kind of let him down. It was willing to let him die and fail as a disposable soldier after he came back from Afghanistan. Whereas these monsters, these outsiders, love him and need him. So he sort of throws in his lot, with them. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I've got too far from the original question, haven't I? Which, remind me, what was it when you really wanted to know?
Well, no, I was asking on the time scales, but
I'm so sorry. Right, yes, no, you did.
You have answered that you are in the late Victorian Edwardian era.
I am. In fact, I haven't even gotten Edwardian yet, and I don't know that I will. One of the things about the Holmes story is that it's so spread out, over 3 decades. That to a modern reader, it's weird to watch our protagonists age so much and change so much. And also it makes the scope of the adventures seem very slow. Watson does say, hey, there's a bunch I didn't write down. But in my version, he's sort of writing down everything that happens. So some of these adventures take place, days after the one before. So I've gone through, I think, 4 years total in the scope of 5 books. And there are reasons that I'm doing that. One of them is this the day of Pinkerton's, Alan Pinkerton's actual death is going to be a turning point in these books. And I think I'm going to replace World War I with the coming of the demon invasion, the loss of the world of man, the loss of, like comfortable London and comfortable Europe as we know it isn't going to be because of an international conflict where all these sort of looming factors finally tip. It's going to be because of an extra-worldly conflict where all the factors that I've been having grow over the books finally tips. For example, in book 2, Holmes makes a case of Silver Blaze. It's a lot like the original. They figure out how the horse had been kidnapped and all that. But in my version, they figure it out as the race has already started. And Holmes is so upset, that he's got a betting slip for this horse that's now worthless. And he took all this trouble to solve the mystery and he's still going to lose, that he retcons it. Retroactive continuity, it's an idea that, Star Trek fans hate, that you retroactively change the stories to make sense. He calls upon a demon named retcon to change what has happened. And he sends Silver Blaze back in time and partway across Britain so he can race. And in doing so, he ruins horse racing. Now, every horse race that starts, one of the horses pukes, faints, buckles, and the ghost of Silver Blaze comes tearing out of it, to this nice supersonic, ride to victory. And it's ruined betting because everyone knows who's going to win. But all I can bet on is who's going to be second and which horse is going to spawn the ghost of Silver Blaze. So it's not an important piece of damage to the world, but it's a noticeable one. And over the course of the books, more and more of these accumulate until the world, which is at first perfectly Victorian and familiar, starts getting weird and damaged and more threatened by change, outside change.
The audience for your books, obviously UK, it's sort of meat and drink to us, anything to do with Holmes and that, it's we live in a world where we half look back with affection to the idea of fog shrouded city of London and hansom cabs going past. But how is it being taken in the US?
You know what? I may sell more per capita in the UK, but I sell a lot more in the US. I'm not even sure per capita how it goes. There is I don't know if you know, we love you. We absolutely love you. There's so many Anglophiles, myself included, in the US. I'm one of those insufferables who can quote you pretty much the entirety of the Holy Grail and Life of Brian. And, raised on Red Dwarf and Blackadder and that idea of being present in, Christmas in Victorian London is, I was never there. Neither were you guys. You were closer than I was. None of us were ever really there. And in a sense, I have some of that nostalgia. I don't think Americans understand that nostalgia for lost empire because we're sort of in our moment of empire now. Yeah. But although maybe losing it, yeah. Enjoy, China. Take that baton and run. So there's a great love for British culture in America and a love for British humor. If anything, my books are seen sometimes as a little dry, a little British, which I betray sometimes and at other times completely embrace. And so, there is that divide. We've got an ocean between us and so much history dividing us. But at the same time, Americans, we love that. I didn't even describe the world because I trust that Dickens and Doyle have done that for me. I can get away with some little description of Victorian London because it is so familiar a setting, even to American audiences, that, you just give a couple words and they go, oh, yeah, okay, I know. Yeah, I'm there. I'm with you.
Yeah.
And of course, to UK audiences, it's automatic. I actually abuse it. The start of book 4 starts with one of Watson's dreams, and he dreams that he's Nelson at Trafalgar, which is, and things are going all wrong. His cannonballs are just bouncing right off the French ships. None of them is going through, and his grand plan is coming to nothing while everyone stares at him and says, I told you so. And it's one of those moments that I think is probably I'm parodying something familiar to many, UK people, like Nelson at Trafalgar is that grand moment. It's lost to history in America, that we love the idea of fighting ships, fighting sail, but mostly it's piracy over here. And because hey, this is where Blackbeard was selling his stuff he stole from you guys, And Nelson is like lost. If people really want to engage with that, I'm challenging my readers. Like they're going to have to look it up, and find that the ship names and the order of advance was accurate, and the wind conditions. And I took all this trouble that poor Americans are ever going to care about, But I've always liked that in books. Taking the trouble to try to get things right, even if generally it won't be enjoyed, because the people who care to dig and care to see that was in a sense, at least derived from accurate events, will enjoy it. For example, there's a picture in book 4, and it's an old poster of Holmes when he was briefly enjoying a career as a boxer and was known as the whirling fisticuffsman. And there's this whole fight poster for him, and the text is much too small to read. But we checked to make sure that it is well duplicated. So if you want to get a magnifying glass and actually go and read all the ridiculous, fight promoters' text for Holmes' boxing days, you can do that.
Good day, gentlefolk. I doth have breaking news. Your Weird Tales host, Charles Christian, has written a new book called Saints and Sinners in Dark Age England. 5 shocking true tales that are stranger than fiction. There's murder, mayhem, treason, incest, adultery, and worse. Read about the real antics of 9 saints. Yes, saints. 8 kings and 5 queens of England, plus the wickedest of all stepmothers. And be amazed, or horrified, or appalled, or all 3. If you love weird history, and methinks you do, hop over to Amazon for your copy of Charles Christian's Saints and Sinners in Dark Age England. Grab yours now.
Do you write any other stuff, either under your own name or other names, or?
It's funny. I have. You'll find like a couple of funny old articles for Wizards of the Coast D&D minis under my name. I'm credited on one Nintendo video game. I was a localization editor for Style Savvy, and a few articles are on the internet. As far as novels, no. I have one that's kind of ready to sell. It's kind of Romeo and Juliet. If the Montagues were the Indiana Joneses and the Capulets were mad scientists. I have another set of books or I shouldn't say that. I have another set of books in my brain and partly on paper.
Right.
set in a fantasy world where the characters, to an extent, know their characters. Everybody knows that they have a persuade score and a strength score and a charisma score, and it goes into the psychology of like, well, who wants to be a fighter? Who wants it to be their main job to stand there and be hit by monsters while some, priest prays to some sort of strange eldritch god to try to keep you alive? Like, what kind of person accepts that job? And they parody other books. The first one is a heist novel set in a fantasy setting. It's called Elf Heist. The second one is he's punished and sent to the war that he's accidentally started, but he's a bard. He's useless on the front lines and is only good as a sort of a force of morale for his unit. It's called the Boogie Woogie Bugle Bard of Company B. And it's really ridiculous. In the third book, we look at his childhood, growing up an elf, taking hundreds of years to grow up while the humans around him grew up faster. And it's parodying Grimm's fairy tales, and what it's like for a childhood to be that dangerous and uncertain. All of these are on the back burner for one grand reason, which is that books make so little money now. I'm sad to say. I've got 4 relatively successful books out, but I still need a day job.
Right.
So yeah,
I was gonna
40 hours a
say,
week,
is there a day job? Yes.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I'm an MRI technologist. So I scan
Right.
MRIs 4 hours a week. I write 20, 25 hours a week. And then I try to keep my 2 kids alive and, and happy and still seeing daddy's face. Say hello to my wife every now and then. They're in the other room. They're one wall away from me being nice and quiet. Well, yeah, a lot of this may have to wait until, God, probably until movie rights sell. And I have the financial freedom to go, okay, great. Now I only write. Now I can. My publisher and my editor don't want me working on the other stuff. They want me working on Holmes. And it's just, I think they're right, because Warlock Holmes, due to the huge fan base and the love for Sherlock that's out there, has legs. It's got staying power. It's been 4 years, and the sales of even of book 1 haven't slowed down. They've picked up because there's so many Holmesians out there, discovering my world. And I think the big thing is discovering that I have lovingly parodied it. I'm not making fun of something that they love. I'm adding hopefully another cool and fun way to engage with Holmes. That's what everyone's doing now. I mean, BBC's Sherlock is definitely an adaptation. Robert Downey Jr.'s Holmes is both of those have a high comic element to them. Elementary is definitely set in the modern world, and a lot of changes to the characters, and all of the new forms of Holmes, which are so potent and so powerful, they're all adaptations. They'll definitely change a lot.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things, if you read the original Holmes, you do have to read quite a few of them to get your brain around the language, because it is language of 140 years ago. You get into it, and eventually it's smooth, and you're quite happy with how it's going. But initially, it does seem slow and clunky, particularly if you start with the novels.
So too, the one that gets me, there's a word in there that you just cannot use anymore. They use it in its proper sense, which means to suddenly burst forth or to suddenly expel. The word is ejaculated. And you just you cannot use that in the modern book. I'm sorry, you can't. The entire world will giggle at you. And so there's a lot of language that has changed. There's a lot of societal expectations that have changed that I love making fun of. My Watson is an empire cheerleader. He really thinks just Britain is the best and will last forever. And in the very first story, he's horrified when he learns of donuts and what a donut is, because he realizes that Americans have industrialized the crumpet. And, how do you compete against that? How does your culture, the stately majesty of the English crumpet, how does that compare with I can make 40 at a time and they're really sweet and bad for you, sort of this unstoppable juggernaut of the donut. Not that I enjoy getting meta, but there you go.
Well, really, I don't think we can better that than the unstoppable force of the donut and its impact on society. Is it worse than Cthulhu? Discuss.
Yeah, right. Perfect. Oh, see, that's why you're the pro.
Well, donuts have probably killed more people than Cthulhu, it's fair to say.
Oh, I'm sure they have. They're killing me. What's killing me actually is French fries. I can't write much at home because I've got these 2 great kids who climb all over me and want to read stuff and do stuff and play. And I live in Las Vegas where there are no books. The libraries all close at 5 or 6. And the only place that stays open that will let me sit late and write is a burger chain of restaurants called Red Robin that has bottomless French fries. They'll let me sit there for 4 hours, just constantly bringing me free French fries and Diet Cokes and a kind word. I swear half of the word count in my books was probably done at Red Robin, and I'm showing it. I think I've gained 4 books and 60 pounds.
Oh, that's wonderful. All right, that was brilliant, Gabe, talking to you. I'll thank you ever so much.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate you. Yeah, we will wait with bated breath. Oh, the girls will be so excited. Oh, hi.
Right, thanks ever so much. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
England, home to zombies, werewolves, green-skinned fairy folk? And how about dragons, strange monoliths and vampires? If you're fascinated by the bizarre and unexplained, join Charles on a road trip around the newly discovered walled Newton Triangle, where fact is much weirder than any fiction. Check out Charles Christian's fantastic Kindle book, A Travel Guide to Yorkshire's Weird Wolds, on amazon.co.uk and amazon.com.
And that's it. Almost time to go, but before we do, my thanks to Patrick Argent, one of our regular contributors. He works for one of the radio stations that syndicate this show, for a story he spotted in the Guardian newspaper about John Shepherd from rural Michigan, who apparently spent the best part of 30 years and a lot of his grandmother's savings building a giant laboratory in his grandparents' house in an attempt to contact alien races in the far corners of the galaxy, primarily by transmitting jazz music from the likes of Sun Ra, Ornette Coleman and John Coltrane, plus a bit of German experimental music by Cannon Cluster. John, perhaps that's the reason why the aliens never got back to you. Anyway, his story has been converted into a short movie by filmmaker Matthew Killip called John Was Trying to Contact Aliens. It won a prize for Best Documentary Short at the Sundance Film Festival earlier this year and is now also airing on Netflix. You can find the official trailer on our website at www.weirdtalesradio.com. And now it just remains for me to say this is Charles Christian saying thank you so much for listening in, and please join me again next week for more weird tales for these weird times we're living through. Until then, stay well, stay weird, stay different.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @ChristianUncut. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.